My subject is this. This is part of the. Is this? Whose is it? This is in the business too. So you want me over here, right? My subject this evening is humane hatred, from anguish to art in the black literature of protest. The recent contretemps in Oklahoma over the request of a schoolgirl to recite Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream indirectly encourages the question of how complete is the acceptance of black protest literature as literature to which everybody ought to be exposed. I am a little disturbed by the implication of one reason I heard for disallowing the recitation, that the speech has racial elements in it. For it is precisely racism that the speech is about in a way. And more importantly, it is racism in American society that made the speech necessary. And yet, it is a speech that rises above racism and testifies to man's unconquerable will. If, to come to the subject of literature, we are to exclude work which is an expression of the experience of white racism, are we not at the same time shutting out the finest example of the resilience of the human spirit over the past 400 years? It may be that the conscious motivation of the officials in this particular issue was no less sincere than in the case of countless others who feel that aggressive black literature does not have a place in the corpus of civilized literature for normal consumption. But there are some at the conscious level, and ever so many more at a subconscious level, who are aptly described by a comment made by C.L.R. James, the West Indian writer, in his book published in 1961, Beyond a Boundary. James wrote, "There are people who, having enjoyed the profits and privileges of racialism for most of a lifetime, now that racialism is under fire and in retreat, profess a lofty scorn for it, and are terribly pained when you so much as refer to it in any shape or form. Their means have changed, not their ends, which are the same as they always were, to exploit racialism for their own comfort and convenience." There are indeed people such as James describes, but it would be unfair and less than true not to acknowledge another aspect. That is, there are those who refuse to face other people's anguish, particularly where they as a people have been responsible for that anguish. I'm reminded here of a Newsweek essay on education published on November the 7th, 1977, and entitled Teachers and Race. Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers, is credited in that article with objecting to the assignment of teachers by race-related criteria in the following words: "We are on the verge of becoming more racially conscious, aware, and divided." I submit that blacks are incapable of becoming more racially conscious and aware, so that Shanker's "we" must mean whites, in which case I confess to a certain horror that surges within me at the intimation that the response of whites to the presence of blacks on more equal terms is likely, in his view, to be increased racial consciousness and awareness of a kind that would lead to further racial disharmony. That, in my view, only strengthens the case for a more intense integration of black protest literature in the educational curricula at all levels. The complete function of literature, as much in our leisured moments as in the classroom, goes far beyond the cozy habit of the aesthetic exercise. Literature is nothing if it does not serve to lead us to the contemplation of human behavior as it affects the total society in which man must live, and the morality which furthers or hinders man's quest for happiness and fulfillment. Given that rationale, it seems inconceivable that we should be tolerant of the underemphasis of a substantial area of American history and experience by excluding or glossing over the aggressive areas of black literature. It is my basic contention that all of us, blacks and whites, Americans, Africans, Europeans, and the rest of the world, have everything to gain and nothing to lose from a square confrontation of what it is to be oppressed and to be oppressor. For until, as human beings, we are prepared to face those awkward truths about ourselves and to ensure that every rising generation is aware of these possibilities in themselves, until then, the continuation of oppression and its resurgence from time to time will continue to plague us. The unease in the presence of this literature, and by extension the experience that lies behind it, is not limited to whites, nor for that matter to Americans. At the very time of the rise of aggressive black literature in the US, the authors themselves raised the question as to whether they were writing art or literature. Writers like Claude McKay, W.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke wrestled with the question. Fortunately, they were to recognize, in the words of Du Bois, that all art is propaganda and ever must be. And not too long ago, middle-class West Indians resented much of their own literature because, as they complained, it contained violence and the ugliness of life. Why do they have to write about these things? Langston Hughes encountered the same attitude, especially after the publication in 1927 of Fine Clothes to the Jew, for which he earned from one critic the label Poet Laureate of Harlem. Another critic was to cry out, "It does not matter to me whether every poem in the book is true to life. Why should it be paraded before the American public by a Negro author as being typical or representative of the Negro?" If blacks are in the main now beyond that stage, others still recoil from what they choose to see as an expression of hatred and racism. Sorry? Let us look a little closer at the reality of that literature of hate. Claude McKay was the one poet of the Harlem Renaissance whom many characterized as a poet of hate. But listen carefully to Claude McKay. "Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess I love this cultured hell that tests my youth." This ambivalent reaction to racist America is to be found more than once in what is his most virulent poems. For example, the poems The White House and The White City. This complexity of response, that is itself anguish, is to be found in black protest literature everywhere. Dennis Brutus in South Africa, writing in a situation that is not entirely unlike what North America was, that is perhaps the outcome of what America was at that time. Dennis Brutus can nonetheless say, "No, I do not brim with sorrow. Anger does not effervesce in viscerally rancid belches or burst its bubbles on my optic nerves. Gall is not secret in my parotids, nor hatred fetid on my breath." Aimé Césaire, one of the founding fathers of negritude, envisages the destruction of those aspects of white civilization that turns it into oppressor. Make me rebellious against all vanity, but docile to its genius. Make of me its executioner. The time has come to gird my loins like a man of courage. But at the execution, let my heart preserve me from all hate. Do not make of me that man of hate for whom I have only hate. I was born of this unique race, yet knowing my tyrannical love, you know, it is not by hatred of other races that I prosecute for mine. All that I would wish is to answer the universal hunger, the universal thirst. Césaire's West Indian colleague, Guy Tyrolien, at the end of a poem in which he is protesting against being stereotyped and simplified by the white image of him, can proclaim, "Yes, I shall glorify man, every man. I shall go to them all with a heart filled with song and hands heavy with friendship, for they are made in my image." And in East Africa, Okot Bibitek has produced in Song of Lawino the latest stage, perhaps, of negritude, where it is no longer necessary to address the white world or to inveigh against it. The audience is now fellow blacks, and the anguish is different when Lawino appeals to her husband Ochol. I do not understand the ways of foreigners, but I do not despise their customs. Why should you despise yours? Listen, my husband, you are the son of a chief. The pumpkin in the old homestead must not be uprooted. As long as these writers are part of a society in which their people are oppressed or in any way victimized because they're black, or for that matter, as long as blacks suffer oppression, victimization, and prejudice as a people anywhere in the world, these writers cannot be immune to the hatred which a hateful system sooner or later engenders in the breast of all blacks. But the writer, as I.A. Richards has observed, is the point at which the growth of the mind shows itself. A writer who becomes imprisoned in anger and hatred is not going to be worth very much to us after all. For we value very highly in literature its capacity to lead us into contact with the infinite varieties of the human condition. And to exercise this gift, a writer needs the whole range of his human feelings. Anger and hatred may provide the creative impulse, but to surrender entirely to them is to run the risk of atrophy. And so the black writer transmutes his hatred into a humane hatred, a hatred that paradoxically rests upon love. He keeps steady before him and cherishes all the beauty that is possible in the human condition, and his hatred is directed to that which threatens it. It is a hatred that seeks on the one hand to liberate the oppressor from the corrosive effects of being oppressor, and on the other hand, to preserve the humaneness of the oppressed. It is this twofold objective that accounts for the coexistence within these works of aggression and what has so often been dismissed as romanticizing, but what is really the countervailing strategy of the assertion of human possibilities. To achieve this, the writer must strive, in spite of all provocation, to remain human and to put cruelty into a human perspective, to perceive that the moral deformity of oppression is, in a sense, more damaging to the oppressor than the oppressed, but ultimately destructive of everyone. Yet, it is hatred and anguish that impart that energy to protest literature and distinguishes it from the literature of social criticism. For we cannot use the term literature of protest to include the normal protestations of social criticism, in the sense in which, say, Hard Times or Middlemarch make powerful protestations. At the same time, the literature of protest is not the only kind of literature to be generated from a given set of experience. The response to the black experience, for example, has differed in time and from country to country and from writer to writer. Affirmation of identity, for instance, is one kind of protestation emerging from the black experience. It belongs to the period or moments when the writer is appealing to human decency in the oppressor or buoying up the dignity of his people. When, in the words of the West Indian poet Edward Brathwaite, hope in my belly, hate smothered down to the bone to suit the part I am playing. It is in this category I would put Langston Hughes's The Negro Speaks of Rivers. But sometimes that hate is and cannot be smothered. Sometimes that hate is not and cannot be smothered deep enough, and therefore it erupts in the imagery or in the tension of the poem or the novel, as the case may be. We saw it in the executioner image of Césaire. And throughout Césaire's classic work, Cahiers, there is violent imagery. The poem, in fact, owes its appeal partly to the tension created by the coexistence of the violent and the gentle, of hatred and love. In Denis Brutus, there is an anger which he refuses to allow to cripple him, but it is anger nonetheless. And in Léon Damas, you feel the smothered rage all the time. If we take a poem like Langston Hughes's Dream Variation, we find that on the surface, it is an affirmation of identity. But beneath the surface, the poem becomes a muted expression of hatred for the white world. The atavistic yearning for freedom expressed in the first stanza becomes an act of defiance by the second stanza, becomes even a challenge to combat in which the destruction of the white world is anticipated. I want to read that poem very quickly. I'm moving a little difficulty. I feel I'm going to be strangled at any time. Dream Variation by Langston Hughes. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done, then rest at cool evening beneath a tall tree, while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream. To fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl till the quick day is done, rest at pale evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. As we look at the poem, the apparently facile equations are energized. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun is at once a yearning for the African homeland, as well as for an equitable place in an America without injustice, when, that is, the white day is done. The night coming on gently is not only an evocation of a tropical twilight, but also of an America where the norm is the morality so devoutly wished for by blacks, while the night comes on gently, dark like me. And the transition from the first to the second stanza is marked by subtle changes. To fling my arms wide in some place in the sun becomes to fling my arms wide in the face of the sun. And till the white day is done becomes till the quick day is done, thus provoking an equation between the sun and white American civilization, and suggesting its death through the use of the word quick, which naturally suggests the quick and the dead. The poem is a cry of anguish, but transcends mere emotion by an artful manipulation of language. I want to refer to two other Langston Hughes' poems. They both very quietly evince the hatred of a system. First of all, there's a poem, Song for a Dark Girl. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. They hung my dark young lover to a crossroads tree. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air, I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. Love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. And here again, Langston Hughes makes good use of the art of surprise in repetition. The first stanza promises a lament for the lynched lover. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. They hung my dark young lover to a crossroads tree. But when we come up against the second stanza, the experience leads to doubts about America's avowed Christianity and threatens the loss of faith. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air, I ask the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? And this is reinforced by the crucifixion image, bruised body high in air, which is probably mocked in the negation of the crucifixion image in the final two lines. Love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. The lament, in fact, turns into an imprecation against America. In Merry-Go-Round, the cruelty of the system is exposed in what it does to the innocent girl, and that is what survives the grim humor of the last four lines. Where is the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? 'Cause I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored can't sit side by side. Down south on the train there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus we are put in the back, but there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's the horse for a kid that's black? The ambivalence in Hughes's attitude to America that lies below the surface of these poems is also there in Mackay, the immigrant. The same subdued tone which gives so much tension to the Langston Hughes poems is to be found in Mackay's poem on a lynching, the poem entitled Lynching. Let's hope I can find that quickly. His spirit in smoke ascended to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. All night a bright and solitary star, perchance the one that ever guided him, yet gave him up at last to fate's wild whim, hung pitifully o'er the swinging char. Day dawned, and soon the mixed crowds came to view the ghastly bodies swaying in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. And little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. Through the subdued tone, the terror mounts, and the poem achieves a note of triple horror: the deed itself, the hard inhumanity of adult onlookers and accomplices, and the damage to the innocent or the lately innocent children. In appearance a sonnet, it is a poem whose complex agony causes it to strain against the formal structure of the sonnet, and the tension and meaning of the poem must be partly sought on that level of analysis. One meaning rests on the Petrarchan division between octave and sestet, separating the victim from the perpetrators. But the two quatrains that make up the octave are pulling in slightly different directions. The first expresses one kind of anguish, for which logically there is not much justification, and must therefore be seen as impelled by a muted hate, the lynched man going to his death without making his peace with God, or could Mackay mean without ceremonial absolution. Then, from this exhibition of Christian faith, the second quatrain poses the possibility of the Christian God's indifference, asking in another way the same question Langston Hughes asked in Song for a Dark Girl. Mackay has often been called the poet of hate, from Alain Locke to the present, but rarely quite without justification. An example of a hate-filled poem might be Enslaved. Oh, when I think of my long-suffering race, for weary centuries despised, oppressed, enslaved and lynched, denied a human place in the great lifeline of the Christian West, and in the black land disinherited, robbed in the ancient country of its birth, my heart grows sick with hate, becomes as lead, for this my race that has no home on earth. Then from the dark depth of my soul I cry to the avenging angel to consume the white man's world of wonders utterly. Let it be swallowed up in earth's vast womb, or upward roll as sacrificial smoke to liberate my people from its yoke. The poem suggests a breach of the divine order of things, matched by the dehumanizing effect it has on him. And no complete response to this poem can see only pure, unmitigated hate. It is a poem which, in its own way, characteristically more vigorous than Langston Hughes's, addresses themes raised in the latter's Dream Variation and Song for a Dark Girl. South Africa is a country where the whites have been entrenched for very long enough to call the country home, though in all conscience they have no moral claim to call home a country which they have so bestialized. Be that as it may, however, the indigenous Azanian neither contemplates nor envisages the destruction or expulsion of the white minority. The black hand held out to the Afrikaner is one of national brotherhood, in spite of the most degrading oppression, systematic and institutionalized. Accordingly, the literature that comes out of those brutalized peoples is so beautiful an exploration of their determination to preserve their humanity. It is surely that they are determined to avoid the ultimate human tragedy, which would be to abdicate one's own human stature in retaliation to unbearable violence. The South African Dennis Brutus has written a poem that, in its significance, summarizes the persistent humanity of the oppressed in that otherwise impossible situation. A common hate enriched our love and us. Escape to parasitic ease disgusts, discreet, expensive hushes stifled us, the plangent wines became acidulous. Rich foods knotted to revolting clots of guilt and anger in our queasy guts, remembering the hungry comfortless. In drafty angles of the concrete stairs, or seared by salt winds under brittle stars, we found a poignant edge to tenderness. And sharper than our strain, the passion against our land's disfigurement and tension. Hate gouged out deeper levels for our passion. A common hate enriched our love and us. One characteristic of black South African literature is the understanding of human weakness and allowing for it. Like Alex Laguma, the South African novelist, in The Fog of the Season's End, Brutus can understand fear. And each, in his own way, celebrates courage, all the more as a result of this understanding. Like Mackay, Brutus understands how humanity is subverted by prejudice, and like Laguma, he can put that into perspective. Brutus's poetry like so much else in black South African literature, shows the determination to remain human, to love what is possible, to refuse to spend oneself in impotent rage. The nature of the racial experience, the social and political context, and the point in time determine the nature of protest literature. To understand this is to understand the differences between the South African situation and the North American situation up to mid-century or so. It is also to understand the unevenness of response in the Caribbean, as indeed in West Africa. One of the interesting characteristics of the phenomenon of protest literature, particularly in the form of negritude, is that negritude, as the very word suggests, has been a francophone phenomenon. And in the Caribbean, the English-speaking writers have never, as you say, got into negritude. And similarly in West Africa, while French West Africa was the African home of negritude, that very prolific nation of writers, Nigeria, produced no negritude writer to speak of, and in fact produced hostility to negritude literature. One remembers Wole Soyinka's statement, which he probably regrets that he ever made. It has been so often quoted. A tiger does not proclaim his tigritude. Why should the Negro have to proclaim his negritude? I was present at the conference when Soyinka made that statement, and I can tell you that it came out just, almost by chance, and has been hung around his neck like an albatross ever since. Of course, in West Africa, there was a spot of what one might call negritude literature in Ghana. It was not so much, well, it is negritude literature in the sense that it shares features of negritude, but it really was a literary manifestation of the political thesis of the African personality, which was popular during Nkrumah's reign. And in fact, the few writers who wrote in the vein of negritude in Ghana were